Thanks, Chair. So first of all, I'd like to say thank you for all your hard work on this, because it's really impressive level of engagement, and it is a complex piece of legislation. So thank you so much for that. I am wondering if, and obviously some of the questions around timelines and things which were a concern have been asked. I particularly found the document that we received in our briefings around your own response to the AGS really useful. And I'm wondering if I can bring your attention to page 3, the second last item there. So it's part 2, head 8, and it reads, due to the fact that, this is from the AGS, I guess, due to the fact that offences arising under this Act are likely to give rise to unusual public interest, it might be worth considering that the direction of the Director of Public Prosecution is necessary in such cases. And then the answer is the Department is engaging with the DPP in relation to this issue and will be guided by their advice. There's no set objections from a policy perspective. Would it be possible for you to expand a little bit on that point?
Yes, certainly. The Garda Síochána have suggested that this legislation would be likely to be contentious, and consequently they would like to, I suppose, send files to the DPP, as I understand it, and the DPP would decide whether or not to proceed with prosecutions. We didn't include this in the general scheme, but I suppose if it is considered necessary or legally desirable, we wouldn't have an objection to it. We have already discussed it briefly with the Department of Justice, who suggested that the most appropriate people to comment on it would be, it might be in some respects resource dependent and could lead to a backlog in people being prosecuted for the offence, if that makes sense. So they suggested that we engage with the DPP, so we have sent the suggestion to the DPP, and that's a very long-winded way of answering you. I'm sorry. That's a very comprehensive way of answering that, and let me just outline my concern there. So I guess, look, involving the DPP, and I think we got from our interaction with the Gardaí that there is concern around the implementation of this law, but I have a concern that if it becomes a standard that we involve the DPP, that's usually reserved for cases where it's not really in the public interest to actually prosecute. And of course there has to be discretion, you know, around those issues. But that if it becomes a kind of an established item within this particular piece of legislation, that you know, it'll be used as a practical barrier to prosecution, and it won't be really a law that is used, you know, because usually when things get sent to the DPP, it's like, is this prosecutable? Is it worth doing it? Why would we do it? And if you introduce that conversation into a piece of legislation, then you're kind of undermining it before it's begun. So obviously we have to wait to see what the DPP says, but I personally would have a real concern there that you're introducing a level of kind of what is the purpose of this law, will we actually prosecute, where there doesn't necessarily need to be one. I suppose, absolutely, I take your point, and that is probably why it wasn't, if that is why it wasn't in the original general scheme. But I suppose seeing it from the Guards' perspective, they're, I suppose, anxious not to proceed with cases which they would feel they would have a difficulty prosecuting. I suppose cases where you're about 2 centimetres over the 100 metres. You know, can they proceed? Now again, as I say, we will wait and see what the DPP has to say about it. Yeah.
Well, I suppose my response to that, if the Guards were here, would be that until you prosecute and you actually test a case, you don't really know that, and actually sending it to the DPP just creates a kind of an artificial barrier before you even get to test the law. And if we continue to use the DPP as that barrier, we'll never actually get to the point where it really gets challenged and tested. And it's really useful to do that. So I would just like to outline my concerns there, that we introduce that barrier to it. And if you do get clarification from the DPP, I think the committee would be really interested in hearing that or knowing that, if it was possible to get our hands on that. I don't know if that's something that you were able to do. Would that be something that that's possible to get, if and when you get it yourselves?
Well, we're hopeful they'll get back to us, absolutely. Yeah,
I think like we could, maybe not separately, maybe a fuller update on the bill and the landing zone for the bill to the committee might be perfect. In which we could incorporate those elements, I think would be. Yeah,
that would be really useful, because obviously there's this huge interest in the legislation.
I'm just wondering, from your interactions with the Gardaí, one of the conversations that we had with them at length was the recording of offences as it stands now, and whether it was possible for them to gather data in a meaningful way as it relates to these kind of events. And at the time, they didn't really have that data. I'm just wondering, have they provided any particular additional data to you on these events? Because we know that they're still happening right now. So I'm just wondering, have you received any additional data from the Gardaí?
On the protests themselves,
yeah.
Not from the Gardaí. We engaged with the HSE themselves. They receive a lot of reports of these type of protests orally, verbally, through the Clinical Advisory Forum.
Okay.
But just, I suppose, evidence of protests in 2022, there was one outside the medical centre in Dodder Park on January 2022. There was one in Dunleary in March 2022. There was one in Milltown in March 2022. There was one in Goatstown in July 2022. I mean, I don't want to take up too much of the committee's time on this.
No, I think it's useful. By the way, I think we could list out many, 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 many more. I'm aware of many. Yeah. So, sorry, just to be clear then, is the way that the Clinical Advisory Forum, is that a formalised way that they're gathering that data?
No. This is just
so it's literally kind of ad hoc.
Sorry, apologies. It's completely informal. Yeah.
Okay. And the Gardaí haven't produced any further data or anything. Do you know of any plans that they have in any of the discussions that you've had?
In fairness, we haven't asked them for this type of data.
Well, we did, just to be clear, but they haven't provided it. Just
no, but we have got it from the HSE. Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. Yeah. And will that be ongoing? That kind of, I know it's ad hoc, I know it might not be very testable data, but it's still useful.
Yeah, and when I was talking about maybe the safe access legislation being one element now of a wider sort of proactive sort of further rollout of the termination of pregnancy services, I would think we'll engage with the HC, but with a view to formalising the intelligence gathering around it, because as I say, with the policy to provide protection and protect the safety of all service users in all potential sites, it will be necessary in implementation to understand where the problems are arising and to direct the Garda resources to where the problems are arising. And even the maps, which we'll have to make available perhaps in relation to all sites, might then get down to street level, and there might be very clarity provided to manage in a graduated way a site such as any of those where there's a persistent problem. So there's just a bit of nuance there, but we do want to think broader than this. Legislation is very important, but the proportion of GPs, for instance, providing the service is so low that there are other issues, and we want to understand them and support GPs in doing it. And sort of
that's very heartening. I think that's exactly the right approach. That it's a kind of a climate of that this doesn't happen. I actually, on that issue, just on the next section down is around the advice of the OPC in terms of the harassment of health service providers, and there's just two items that I just want to clarify, maybe just kind of more for the record than anything, we may see a kind of an unintended consequence as these protests are not possible within the location of an area, that things kind of move at a distance, so that there might be harassing phone calls or things that happen digitally, more focused on service providers than service users. And I just want to clarify that those kind of acts would be covered under that section 10 of the non-fatal offences, that kind of harassment, or would that be in the newer law?
Section 23, we understand it is to replace Section 23 of the Criminal Justice Miscellaneous Offences Bill, is to replace Section 10, we understand, quite soon. And when we engaged with the OPC, we went down through the type of conduct that we were seeking to prohibit under Head 8, and they were of the view. Now, on foot of your comments this morning, we will definitely be re-engaging with them, but they were of the view certainly that type of conduct was closed, that would be closed off under Section 23.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then for clarity, the previous page where it's confirmed that there's intention to allow what may otherwise be prohibited conduct within 100 metres of the houses of the Oireachtas, people will still be able to protest us and still be able to come to the houses of the Oireachtas. Yes.
Fortunately.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And thank you again for all your hard work. I had another question, but it's completely gone out of my head now, so thank you, Chair.